Preparing to live stream the meeting. Oh, it says it's now live streaming. Are we live streaming?
Indeed we are.
I have to remember to shut down the YouTube because that happened. Right, we're live streaming. We're on YouTube. Should we start the podcast? Does anyone have any questions before we start? You're all happy. Okay, I'm going to read the intro. Welcome back to yet another episode of the Tech for Good Live podcast. If you listen carefully, you might just hear the sound of sleigh bells ringing. Why? Because it's the Christmas podcast. Right now, across the world, parents carry out their most treasured Christmas tradition, sterilizing the chimney and immediate areas around the Christmas tree. Remember, Santa is very, very old and quite overweight, so he's in a high-risk category. Protect him, please. Keep your filthy, diseased hands away from him. Anyway, we have a great show lined up for you today, and we're streaming live as we record, hence the chaos. The Tech for Good Live team has grown over the last year, so there's about 1,000 of us on this podcast. And we're going to take a look back on some of the highlights and the lowlights of the last year. Think of it like Charlie Brooker's screen wipe, but without the talent or audience. Okay, for the last time this year, let's get podcasting. So strapped in and helping me pull Santa's sleigh this year, we have Greg Ashton. Hello, Greg.
Hello.
We have Johnny on the podcast. Hello, Johnny.
Hello.
Mariam is back on the podcast. Hello, Mariam.
Hi, everyone.
We're also joined by Anka. Hello, Anka.
Hello.
Hira is back on the podcast after a 9-month hibernation. Hello, Hira.
Yes, I'm here.
And what is that? Is that Ben White I can see? Ben, hello.
Hello.
Harry Bailey may or may not be joining us halfway through the podcast. It wouldn't be a Christmas podcast without that kind of chaos. So we'll say hello to him if he pops up. Who knows? We've also probably going to have a few of the other Tech for Good Live team popping in. Maybe we've got Alina in the background, although she probably won't speak, although I might make her speak. We'll see what happens. Who knows? And me, I'm Bex. I'm tasked with keeping us on track. Send help, please. I didn't say Faye. Faye is here. Hi, Faye.
Thanks. Nice to be back. And remembered, clearly, so whatever.
Important member of the team, Faye. So let's just get straight into it. We have a little bit of a different way of running the podcast on the end of year podcasts. We just do what we want. So it's a little bit of a roundup of the year. And what kind of roundup would it be if we didn't start with ourselves? Johnny, you've prepped some stats.
I mean, I feel you're playing fast and loose with the word prep there, but because Greg normally does this session and Greg tends to put work in, so this is quite a quick overview. But I think obviously 2020 has been a horrible year, but there were some kind of positives for the Tech for Good Live podcast. So for a weekly show where we also have breaks between seasons, we've done 65 episodes this year, which I don't understand how that works out in terms of maths, but that's something that's happened. We did 5 community-led Black Lives Matter specials. In other stats, we've had over 21,000 listens because there's a lot of strange, lonely people out there, I guess. And I think it's probably quite an underestimate because Apple are quite opaque with their stats. In terms of who's listening, other than the kind of desperate and lonely, 78% come from the UK, then the US is 16%, and there's some from France, Canada, and New Zealand as well. I won't attempt accents. And in terms of how are people listening, the Apple Podcast is where people tend to listen most. But Overcast and Stitcher, which are real words, and podcast.co, we have a landing page there. They tend to get some. No one from Spotify, which is strange. I didn't know if people listen to podcasts on Spotify. So they're the kind of stats that I pulled out with bare minimum of effort to get to them. But in theory, people are listening and they're listening on different devices. So yeah, I feel we know a lot more about the podcast now. I feel we can feel more informed. Quantitative stats isn't my thing. I'm more of a qualitative guy. I ask 5 people and they say they like it. And then I can say confidently we're the most popular podcast in the world. This is not really my area of expertise, but there are people out there. There is a podcast. Some people have listened and we've done episodes, which I think is a thorough roundup that we can all be truly thankful for.
Cool
Nailed it.
story, bro. Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh,
Okay. I'm going to
Just
retreat for a while.
30 seconds of that looking at Greg's face and deep sadness behind his eyes.
We'll never let Johnny do this again. And Johnny's like, yay. Yeah.
Never again. Never again.
I mean, we
To be
probably had some
fair-
cool guests as well. What cool guests did we have?
We did have guests, and some of them were cool. I dug into the data and discovered that. I mean, to be fair,
Wow.
I've not really been on the podcast much this year. So the guests that I've experienced are mostly on this podcast who are now part of the team, and they were wonderful. You know, everyone else was like second tier guests. If you've been a guest and you've not been promoted to the full team, you know,
Be ashamed.
I think that speaks for itself.
I also just wanted to do a shout out to some of the other things that we do. We don't just do podcasts. We also usually run events as well. But we kind of sacked off the events during COVID-19 because we wanted to be more useful. And we started matching up volunteers locally to where we are based in Greater Manchester to charities who needed help digitally. And we got 70 requests for help in like a month or two. So obviously there was a need for it. We got 50 volunteers signed up, and about 45 of those were nicely matched. And some positive outcomes were had. So that was cool. And definitely the comms team as well. You know, like it's hard to shout out saying our newsletter and social media was great, but it was. So I just want to say like a big thanks to the wider team as well. Yeah, shout out to us. Aren't we great? But moving on to Greg's topic, I think this is really interesting. So you did a little bit of an analysis about all of the stuff we talked about in podcasts over the year. And what did you find, Greg?
Yeah, so normally we kind of have been a bit led by what's in the news, but because of we tried something a little bit different this year to steer things more into the wheelhouse of our guests. So what I found was we quite often had very focused episodes. So there was one episode where we talked a lot about mental health, and it was actually quite prevalent in the news at the time. But what you invariably find is there are a couple of key trends that flow throughout the year. Avoiding COVID as a major trend, although it does come up. There was 5 areas that I've grouped together that I kind of picked out as a thread running through. And they've become even more relevant in the last couple of weeks as well. So probably the biggest topic that we talked about was global tech companies and kind of the local legal battles. So thinking of Facebook, Amazon, Apple, you know, all the big players and the kind of legal battles that they've faced in the US and across various countries, the EU, the UK, conversations that have been going on around that. And, you know, in this last week, we've seen that really shifting gear now to see some real action being taken. And, you know, there's some big questions. There's writing on the wall about how they're going to advance into next year. I'll be interested to see. To be honest, I think it's probably going to be a slow, laborious process with probably really, really kind of lots of Pyrrhic victories and lots of like really painful, most likely political grandstanding, which will get in the way of that. Closely tied into that as well, we've got misinformation and radicalization on social media. Has really,
I think I remember this was like one of the first podcasts we did after COVID.
yeah.
It seemed like a big thing at the time, and it's just not gone away.
No, and it's got even worse. And we knew it was an issue previously, but I think COVID's almost kind of not drawn a light to it, but like almost like funneled it into like its purest form of insanity now.
Are we talking about fake news on the podcast? Is that what we're getting to here?
My God,
yeah.
it was a one-time mistake, and you will never let me forget it.
Hey, it's a
One
whole
time.
section. It's coming up in the data here, Faye. That's all I
This
can
is
say.
this is what everybody says, Faye.
Yeah, it's what people are
Yeah.
talking about. Word on the street is about fake news, Faye.
I need to change my Twitter bio. That'll be my new handle.
I mean, that's the key thing that we found when we looked through this, was that the source of all misinformation is Faye. Basically, that's where it all started. You know, anything that's going wrong in the world started with Faye's lies. So yeah, there you go.
Wow.
You heard it here first.
So everything from misinformation to COVID is my fault, basically.
No,
Alright.
I mean, COVID's not your fault. That's Johnny's. Dirty-handed Johnny, as we call him. So moving on to COVID.
Like
So
I
we
missed
had to bring it up at some
podcasting.
point.
There was nothing this exciting before. Global conspiracies, disease spreading, lockdown as a result of the Tech for Good podcast.
It was a good way to drive up engagement. Lock people in their houses with nothing else to do.
Was
And
it
then-
worth it? Well, 21,000 viewers tells its own story.
Yeah.
I wonder how many of our viewers didn't make it, and it's all our fault. We should probably reflect on our practices, maybe. Just a little thought.
No, I think most of our viewers, listeners will have been self-isolating for many years now, so they'll be used to it. So they'll be fine. Although their immune systems will be terrible. So who knows? Who knows?
This took a dark turn. Quickly move on.
Well, I'm going to move on to COVID. So yeah, governments versus COVID. There was so many stories about governments versus COVID. We were looking at the tech and the challenges around that. We were looking at like economy versus lives. So talking about the lockdown and the approaches there, and the kind of social management of those lockdowns and the approach to research. And then we were looking at social messaging, so the hands, face, space, and all those kinds of things about, who's doing the right thing, what are the right approaches, and the challenges that various governments faced in that process. We touched on Sweden at one point being a great example of how to do it, and then suddenly, in the last few months,
Oh no!
yeah, they totally suddenly they got it all wrong. So yeah, it's been a real year of turnarounds. Like we were like regaling them as brilliant, and then suddenly they got it all wrong. So yeah, that one's been obviously, for obvious reasons, a constant one throughout the year.
Did we mostly praise Sweden to annoy Mills though? Because there's a whole Norwegian Mills rivalry.
Yeah, pretty much.
Maybe. Okay.
Pretty much anything to wind Mills up. I'm going to move on to so climate, but we're going to talk about that more shortly. So climate change has weirdly, kind of come out one of the winners from this year. Obviously because people were locked down, they weren't using the cars, but also you're seeing some really great movements from governments, particularly the UK government, about efforts to continue the benefits and the positive impacts that have happened through COVID, and to come back better and do more. It'll be interesting to see. Biden's talking a lot about the climate change and going back to the Paris Accord. So yeah, there's a real opportunity to see some benefits from that. We had a real mixed year for charities. So you had some real winners and losers. Charities have, in many cases, done really well. We had Captain Tom doing his fundraising, but you've had others that have really, really struggled. A lot of restructures that have happened in the National Trust, the Teenage Cancer Trust as well. So they've had some real highs and lows. And I think, next year we're going to start to see some real data around how bad charities have had it. And with the, kind of rising issues related to COVID, I think next year is going to be a tough one for the charity sector. And it'll be interesting to see the response to that. And one of the other things that the charity sector had, in particular the National Trust, and that feeds into the other topic that was a major one for us in the middle of the year, is Black Lives Matter, racism and inclusion in general has been a key topic that's thread throughout the year, on many different topics. Last year we talked about #CharitySoWhite, and that hasn't gone away. The stories from that have continued through this year, and then become even more pronounced with the Black Lives Matter movement, and the kind of the realization that all those positive gains that we'd seen in past years were just hiding this subtle and pervasive kind of racist culture that runs through the whole of our lives. And it's really nice to see that people are now having discussions about that and facing the reality that we're living in a society that isn't as inclusive as we would have liked. Nice note to end on there for you.
Yay. I mean, we knew an end of year podcast for 2020 wasn't going to be good, right?
Yeah, but I think it's given us loads to talk about, which is great. So, anything that greases the wheels of the old podcast, great. Next year.
I'm not sure that makes it all worth it. It feels like a very... I feel silver lining would be really overselling that.
COVID-19, good content. I don't think that works. Let's move on then. Let's try and be more positive. We'll move on to top positive stories from the year. And we've got Anchor, Ben and Faye leading on this segment. So I'll leave you all to it. I don't know who wants to go first with the positive stories.
Hard to follow, but I'll try. One of the things that I think really stuck out to me in terms of the positive stories that we talked a little bit about this year is this thread that I think has actually gotten buried the past couple of years with Donald Trump and all the other kind of misinformation or distractions out there, which is that renewable energy is actually proving itself as the future, not just in terms of addressing climate change, but actually as a driver of economic growth or job opportunity. And I think often there's these old arguments that conservative politicians or the fossil fuel industry have tried to push, which is it's either you can address climate change or you can have jobs and you can have opportunity. And what we've talked about a bit a couple of weeks ago is that renewable energy is really driving job growth. In the US, there was a study that showed that renewables created more than double the number of jobs that the fossil fuel industry created in the US between 2016 and 2019. There was a Guardian article that made the case that renewables are really driving economic growth even this year, despite COVID. And they found something that like 90% of all new global electricity generated in 2020 is coming from renewables, which is kind of a mind-boggling statistic. And so I think it just points to an opportunity for a green recovery in 2021 as governments start to see investing in renewables as both a way to address climate change and rebuild the economy. I think the challenge, of course, is one, to make sure that it happens at a pace that's fast enough to meet the climate crisis, but also to make sure that it's happening equitably so that the benefits of this new industry don't just accrue to the same top 1% that have had it for a long time, and making sure that these jobs are actually being distributed equitably across gender and racial lines. So I think that's going to be interesting to see. Biden has this climate plan that has a lot of good elements to it, but the question is, will it grow at the speed that it needs to, and will it actually reach the communities that it needs to? And I'm curious if that's the same kind of concern that you all are facing as well in the UK.
Yeah, like I mentioned before, the UK government's been making a lot of positive claims, but whether they'll, it's okay to kind of make those claims, but it's actually fulfilling that with action is the real challenge. But we had a really good point earlier in the year where the UK had the longest period where the country had solely been run on renewable energy. So we know it's possible. We know it's a stable energy source. So it'd be really interesting to see if we can put our money where our mouth is and push more of that innovation through.
I've got the lag, so I'm going to be interrupting people left, right, and center here. This has been happening all day on various different video messaging platforms. Do you think how much of this has been triggered? How much of it is genuinely been triggered by COVID and the pandemic and lockdown? Is it kind of like it's certainly something that's been moving this way for a while, but do you think this has been the sort of the tipping point, to use a horrendously overused phrase?
Yeah, it's interesting. So in a previous life, I used to work for a solar energy company. And one of the arguments that we were always having since 2010, 2011 is making the case that renewables were actually cost effective, right? That they could stand up against fossil fuels. And so I think that trend has been happening for a while. And there's been a lot of effort to make the price of renewables just comparable to or better than fossil fuels in many cases. And I think the trend now, or the question now to me is, does this position that we're in with COVID get looked at by governments as an opportunity to actually rethink not just how we're tackling climate change, but how we think about our economy, right? How we think about inequality and equity. And I think if we do that, then there's like an opportunity to really shift it. But, I don't know. I mean, in the US, we had movement towards, these kind of COVID relief bills that gave folks, a small check at the beginning of the year, and then it kind of got shut down. So I'm not super hopeful with the current state of our kind of Senate and government, but with Biden and Harris, at least there's some opportunity for that. But yeah, I'm not sure, to be honest.
Yeah, I cannot put it into like a political context in the same way as you guys obviously can, but it does seem to me there's kind of like a bit of a sentiment shift. We do some work with corporate social responsibility and like impact measurement, so various sustainability measures and contribution towards SDGs. And we've just seen like a huge kind of spike of interest in that this year, with a lot of businesses really genuinely interested in sort of kind of recommitting or committing to kind of sustainable operation this year. And I'm kind of not sure if it's like this weird confluence of a bunch of social movements and a lot of people with time on their hands, but there's definitely there's a real kind of noticeable change in the air in terms of the conversations that are being invited around how sort of a lot of businesses are run and managed. So yeah, fingers crossed it isn't just kind of a weird blip and everything gets back to normal, but that's something we can take from this.
One thing I would say is a cautionary tale, which is I think we're going to see a whole new wave of greenwashing from certain organizations. So I found out the other day, so when you buy energy, and this is in the UK, I don't know what it's like everywhere else. When you buy energy in the UK, obviously you're hooked up to one energy system. So it's not like you can funnel in different energy from different places. So if you're buying renewable energy, it's not necessarily that's what's going to come to your home. But what I didn't realize was that they have what are called green credits. And if somebody produces an amount of green energy, they get like a certificate, but they can sell that certificate if the energy is not used to a non-green producer. So you've got people like E.ON who are coming out and saying they do 100% renewable energy, but the reality is that they don't. They just they use those credits to claim that they do. So it's a really murky world of this kind of backdoor dealing that they probably think is perfectly fine. But I think if you presented that to the public, they'd have a completely different view on that. So
I have no idea how that even works. So like that's so confusing.
Yeah. It's and the kind of course you're not going to plug in a new energy supplier every time you change supplier, but for someone to say we're green when they're not, all they're doing is buying the claim from somebody else just seems horrendous. So
it's so confusing. I remember once working with a green energy company, and the team themselves found out during a call that the energy was neither green nor energy. Like even they didn't know. Like it's such a confusing thing.
Abstract commodity that's traded 5 times around the world. It started off as pork bellies. It ended up. Yeah, it is horrendous.
It started off as pork bellies.
Well, I was trying to think of a commodity Vex, and on the spot, that's the one that that's my go-to commodity. Gold, tin, pork bellies.
Brilliant.
But yeah, no, I think you're right, Greg. I don't know if this is kind of like the necessary teething troubles of something going mainstream, becoming popular, having a bunch of cowboys fiddle around the edges and try and kind of game the system. So whether it's kind of a necessary evil, but I think that's a very fair point. I will say, we had very specific rules at the positive section, and I'm not sure if they're being honoured by the entire team. Faye, you had some like amazingly positive news this year that good things happened.
Well, I don't know if it's amazingly positive, but in the light of 2020, it's better than maybe some of the stuff we've discussed so far. But yeah, my positive story was kind of all about Stop Hate for Profit, which if you haven't heard about that, you may have been living under a rock, but was the big movement back in June, which encouraged big brands to basically halt their advertising with Facebook. As anyone who out there listens to our podcast, which basically includes my dad and Johnny's mum, you know that we talk about Facebook a lot, and we talk about how evil Facebook can be. And it finally kind of woke up the big brands to sort of realize, yeah, actually, why are we giving our money to a system that is kind of, is profiting off hate, racism, misinformation, and everything else? And there was basically a big advertising boycott. A big advertising boycott in June, and then an Instagram blackout in September, just to kind of really make a stand for the first time that this isn't okay. This shit isn't okay for like this level of hate, anti-Semitism, disinformation, bigotry. Everything that's evil in the world just exists in the ecosystem that is Facebook and the Facebook empire. And obviously, as we've kind of seen in recent weeks with, the law cases being put out against Facebook, the call for like the Facebook network of Instagram, WhatsApp, Messenger, and everything else to kind of be broken down, it's the start in my mind of a positive shift. Like people aren't willing to kind of accept this anymore. And I think 2020 has really been the year for that, because we have all spent more time online. We've all been stuck inside for God knows how many months, 9 months now or whatever. And we've been living our social lives even more online than we normally would do. And people have just kind of begun to peel back the facade that, Facebook's great. It's how I send like cute pictures of my dog to like whatever. But it's a lot more than that. And it's become a really dangerous way for hate to spread and misinformation to spread. So for me, it was really positive to see some big name brands stand up and say, no, I'm not doing this anymore. And I hope that will continue into the new year. So that was my positive story. And this wasn't sponsored by fake news. Stop Hate for Profit actually did take place in June. It's out there on the internet. It's real. I'm not making that up.
You're undermining it, Faye. The more you mention it, it's kind of...
Shut up, Ben!
They set up just to combat Faye's fake news, to be honest. Yeah. You were kicked off Facebook because of this. I remember the stories in The Guardian. Yeah.
It does feel like that, doesn't it, Faye? Like these are now big institutions to be shot at, lobbied against, to be kind of smeared and all that stuff, and all those kind of weird, antiquated, very slow-moving methods that we have for controlling these wild, out of control things are starting to apply to tech now, despite the best efforts of them to kind of like close their eyes and try and continue to slip under the radar. That's. I guess some of these positive things are kind of reactions, aren't they? The sort of reactions to bad things happening, and we're classing them as positive. Which, okay, let's take that. It is take for good. One of the things that I kind of noticed was that we alluded to this before. The charity sector has had an incredibly difficult time because a huge amount of its income and income generating kind of opportunities have just simply stopped. And a lot of its kind of capacity, based on sort of face-to-face activity, voluntary activity, again, has just become really, really untenable. That is not a good thing. It has prompted some people to start shifting and sort of to think about balancing out a lot of this traditional income generation and sort of service delivery and trying to add the digital elements. And I don't think that's something to be kind of over the moon about because of the circumstances. It certainly isn't, but there's definitely opportunities that opens up, and there's definitely kind of new ways and better ways of charities working that are now being kind of forced upon them in the most unpleasant of circumstances, but hopefully will be massively beneficial in the long term. Obviously we work with Age UK. I'll mention this briefly because it is a client, but they have the call in time service, which is an incredible service that allows isolated older people to be put in touch with people with similar interests and have regular conversations. And obviously we went from a situation where that was kind of a service that was really well used to suddenly the amount of people who needed that just vastly expanded overnight with the lockdown situation and the sort of, the massive risk that COVID does place older people under. And so being able to kind of see that scale up very quickly is a crisis response, but the fact that those responses are possible is kind of really heartening in some ways. And I think there's loads and loads of people. We've also been working with volunteer groups, peer support groups who can no longer meet physically and have had to meet online. Huge challenges, not as good an experience in the vast majority of cases, but it is opening up different connections. So if you kind of have a condition and your local peer group doesn't really have anyone who you can relate to because of the specificities of that condition, you suddenly, if you're plugged into a national network, you can find people who are in a much closer situation. You have much more comparable lived experience. So it kind of changes the nature of how those groups can work for the benefit of the users. And I think, again, it's you're taking the good out of the bad, but that's an interesting thing, positive thing that should really last kind of way beyond the pandemic and sort of do good way beyond that. So that's a nice thing that I've noticed.
Yeah, definitely. And I just want to add to that and build on it that I really liked the meme that went round, I think probably within the charity sector or the charity tech for good sector, at least, where it was like a fake survey that said, what has prompted your digital transformation more than anything else? Has it been a supportive CEO, a digital agency, or COVID-19? So like literally for my entire career, I've been trying to digitally transform charities and it didn't work. And then COVID-19 made it happen, which is great. And it's really good to see. And I think building on that as well, like I think a lot of the concerns charities were having were around digital inclusion. So what about the people I can't reach? I heard all the time. And, I don't think anyone came up with a really good answer to that. But I think what did happen was more widely, people understood the concept of digital inclusion and the needs of those who are digitally excluded and data poverty. I remember I've seen so many people like hear that term for the first time and be completely bowled over by the concept of it. And I think that's a positive thing that more generally people are upskilling in this kind of stuff as well.
It's kind of gone from a concept that you can ignore and you can use as an excuse not to do anything to a concept that you actually can't ignore and has to be tackled. And again, not the right circumstances. Just want to stress the podcast had nothing to do with the pandemic. There's no agenda here, but it will have a lasting benefit, and that's kind of heartening. I have another one. I have a more techie one. If anyone wants to hear a more techie tech for good about computers and stuff. The AI, the protein folding by AlphaFold. DeepFold, something folded proteins, and I forget exactly the name of the software, but did you guys discuss this at all? Oh, okay, right. Wow. This I think this is kind of a small story, and it's also a story that's got like a horrific underbelly. So I'll do the nice bit on top first, and then talk about the terrifying potential. But this is Deepmind, which was the company Google acquired a few years ago that does a lot of the kind of artificial intelligence work and the neural networks. And there's been a sort of a problem in science in terms of how to map the physical kind of manifestation of proteins. So they've known for quite some time, like the sequence of kind of like the component parts of these proteins, they know what's in them. But actually, when those parts combine, they create like a unique shape, and the properties of the shape kind of determine the effectiveness of it, how it kind of be used in medical treatments, gene therapy, all kinds of stuff. And to kind of extrapolate that shape was like an absolute nightmare, taking, years, tens of years in some points to actually sort of map these things. Experimentally, incredibly hard to kind of detect and understand the shape of these proteins. And so they've run a competition every year to try various different techniques of kind of understanding how to do this. And I think it's 2 years now that DeepMind's been competing. The first year, it kind of did better than all the previous techniques. This year, it kind of did so much better that it seems like everyone's hailing this as a massive major breakthrough, like problems that, could not be solved with years and years of research are now being done in kind of days and potentially, even quicker by the artificial intelligence. So that's going to have loads of, medical applications, which is great. That's very positive. It's also quite terrifying to me, though, because I think we're going to have more of this. I think we're going to have more of the reality that we kind of live in being based on models, artificial intelligence models. So there's going to become a point where actually, and this sounds crazy, but the experiments that we can do to understand literally what these proteins look like are kind of less accurate and kind of completely impractical, as opposed to having that artificial intelligence guess very accurately what they might be. And that's going to become the basis of all the sort of future research, is actually not observational experimental work, but like kind of models of how things probably will work. And so this is kind of like incredibly interesting in two senses. It's moved on the field by, people were saying that we might not achieve this in our lifetime. Now we can start mapping all these proteins, in the space of weeks. But it's all kind of based on the AI. And, I'm sure we've probably spoken about that at some point last year, about the dangers of that. So I thought that was kind of a cool tech for good, but also tipping into the tech for terrifying side.
I think you've been watching too much devs, Ben. Like,
Yeah.
I totally agree. Like that use of AI is absolutely amazing, but it's amazing because they've tried so hard to find uses for AI in healthcare, and every single one so far has been pretty shit. And this is particularly
apart from one, which I think is worth mentioning, because I always talk about AI for bad as well. This is a good one. So apparently, like, AI models are much better at detecting breast cancer than actual doctors. And when I told my husband, who is a radiologist, about this, he was like, yeah, no wonder. And I was like, why? And apparently, radiologists hate scanning women's bodies because they're not used to them. They think there are lots of extra bits in there. So they're terrible at detecting anything to do with ovaries or breasts, even female radiologists. So apparently it's like an inside joke. And I was like, wow, this explains it. Because the first time I heard about AI being better at radiologists and thinking breast cancer, I was like, what, really? But there are so many complications. And yeah, I was like, okay, for something like as a first pass, obviously like AI is probably better because it focuses on those things. But yeah, for a detailed analysis, of course, there's no way a computer can beat a human to look at that.
Well, isn't that a terrible reason for that to be a good AI? I mean, like,
imagine my face when he was telling you this. I was like, wow. Just the nonchalant way it came out.
Then till halfway through the story. But that is a really good use. I think there's other similar applications of AI in medical tech where you've got essentially a shit ton of images, and people normally look at a screen to diagnose them, and they're pretty good at it, but it takes a while, and then they're not as good as a computer that can kind of like amalgamate all of these things. The breast cancer one was the one I was aware of, but I think there's been other kind of examples of that. So, but yeah, we can lump that into one non-shit use of AI.
Yeah, and I think that's the positive note from this, is that we're kind of getting past the glitz and glamour stage now into the stuff that probably isn't as sexy, into what I've called stuff before, it's beautifully mundane. It's probably the things that, the nitty gritty scientists are probably going to love, but it's not really going to get you loads of headlines. And that's where AI is actually going to have a huge impact on people's lives, not, curing cancer or something like that. It's
you know what? I've been working recently with a really, really cool AI data scraping tool, and it's actually like really good and works for signposting. And that's so boring, but it's really good. And it's the first application I've personally come across as AI where it doesn't seem like bias matters particularly for this, and it will work better than humans trying to do it. So yeah, really boring stuff it might be good for.
But you know what, Bex? We still haven't let Greg finish his point. He's like mid-sentence still. we had 3 interruptions. Was that it? Did you reach the full stop?
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Thereabouts.
Transcription? Yeah. Would you class transcription?
Ooh, no, because it's what you actually winding me up, Ben.
I think it's a troll. Don't bring up AI transcription with Bex. She's going to come round to your house and cut you.
It doesn't work. It's trash.
I just want to try that transcription tool out. Whenever said, "Oh, it's dead easy," the tool doesn't get to the work.
I'm just waiting for Otter AI to somehow find their way into the Zoom chat to go, "Hello, did someone mention automatic transcription?" We're like, "Fuck off!"
It's like you're trying to transcribe a call.
Yeah, it looks like you're trying to poorly transcribe something with multiple accents and stuff. Yeah, wonderful.
I was saying that if we used the output of our transcripts via an AI transcription service, we could use it as like a Tech for Good live version of Lorem Ipsum. That's how useful it is.
It would be comedy. It would be so funny. Like, oh god, yeah. I actually think it's not a bad idea, Bex. Of us just
wait, would people buy that? We could sell that.
It could be a blooper reel of just like, here's what we said, here's what what the system said, and it could just be a funny episode by itself. I think
tell
this
the
would be a
difference. Try to
great
tell the difference which
question.
one is real, which one is just.
Oh my God, yeah. Do we reread? Or do we do a podcast, transcribe it, and then do a second podcast just reading the script from the thing?
Yeah, but the
this
problem
is
is that one might be
great.
higher quality. Like,
Exactly.
oh, actually, this thing makes some good point. I've never heard Johnny make so much sense before. Like, oh yeah, that's the one where it
If
did.
you give it enough data, it will learn not to be of higher quality. That's the key. Just needs a load of technical podcasts. It'll get the level.
No, Harry's joined us. Hi, Harry. You have to say hello. It's a podcast.
Hello.
Great.
You are live on YouTube as well, Harry, just so
Nice
you
to see all
know.
your faces. Sorry, I'm so
It's all right. I said that you would join halfway through, and you joined almost exactly halfway through. So thank you for your promptness. And we're going to move into your segment now. So just throwing you in there. But we're on 2021 predictions. So this is Mariam, Hira, and Harry. I'll let you all get on with it.
I wouldn't want to go first as the newcomer.
Amazing. Well, I think Mariam is kind of putting all of us to shame, because when I was looking at our script notes, I had like 2 bullet points that were like 1 sentence each. There were a couple of commas, yes, but
Oh my
Mariam
God.
has like a whole A4 size sheet of like comments in there. And yeah, so I think Mariam, you take the lead. What are your predictions?
Oh, it's not even a lot. It's like, I'm probably only going to say like 1 minute of this. But I mean, well,
Says everyone who gets an A+ in class. You are that person.
I mean, I am busy, so it's a tradition. Well, my predictions are kind of coming out of the election because I'm still in like this debrief space, and I'm literally doing nothing else with my life besides working and talking about post-election reports. But one very interesting thing that actually came up in some of the conversations I was having was the prevalence of in-language tools and in-language campaigns used to get out the vote this past election cycle, and just like the number of organizations that were increasing their strategy on platforms like WhatsApp and Viber, Kakao Talk, which is like a Korean messaging app, WeChat, which is a Chinese messaging app. And so there's like been a huge like influx of new organizations testing out this new territory and just basically figuring out if they can actually engage with people through this, and if these platforms can be used like for effective like advocacy tools, like the way Facebook and Instagram are. And yeah, so my prediction is that, I mean, the orgs are seeing really great results. I think we already knew that like there's a lot of communities in the United States that are often ignored by mainstream parties. There's a lot of communities. There's like been a very long history of people who don't have English as their first language, not even being able to have resources to actually vote, right? That's why the Voting Rights Act came in the 1960s and stuff. But yeah, so now there's a lot of orgs popping up and they're testing it out. So my prediction is that I hope, honestly, it's more of a hope than a prediction, because I don't think the Democratic Party ever learns from people on the ground. But the hope / prediction is that there's going to be a lot more investment in testing in these apps and just a more robust organizing strategy using these apps to really mobilize people. One of the organizations I was talking to had a really interesting, they were sharing like some of the experiences that they had like in October. And what's really interesting is Republicans actually have really strong messaging. I don't know how they're doing it, but they're very strong on WhatsApp. I don't know if they're actually actively organizing on WhatsApp, or if their messaging just like is really salient and just like, is able to latch on to like WhatsApp groups of like, especially like immigrant communities and like other like smaller like minority communities, but they've got a strong hold there. And I think it is connected to misinformation as well. And like the prevalence of misinformation on like, especially on WhatsApp and Viber and those types of platforms. But the organization I was talking to, they're in Las Vegas. They're an Asian American organization that's progressive. And their goal is like, we just want to make sure everybody knows how to vote. Like that's what they're trying to do. And so they're accessing a lot of communities right now and like hopping into group chats and like putting out ads and stuff like that. And they're getting really great traction. And they came across like this Taiwanese community in Las Vegas who had been living there for like 20 years, and it's the first time they're voting, and they're actively having voting parties for Trump. And it's like a fascinating phenomenon, like what's happening here. But at the same time, they're messaging the progressive orgs to get just fact checks on, wait, but can you like tell me how to vote? Like, I actually trust you. Like, tell me what I need to do to make sure my vote actually counts. And so it was a really interesting experience that the organizations were having of, okay, I mean, could you not vote for Trump? but I also want to make sure that you actually get out to vote because, you know, we're like about civic engagement and that everybody has the right to vote and all that kind of stuff. So I don't know, it was just an interesting conversation I had that I just wanted to share here because I think it's something to think about of just like the use of these platforms, especially like as we're starting to see like different orgs become very important in like key swing states and like elections and stuff like that. So yeah, that was one prediction. And then connected to that, my other hope was that I don't know if this is actually going to happen, but I mean, we were just talking about misinformation. I mean, we've got Faye here, fake news, Schofield, leading the campaign.
Wow, you've been part of the podcast for like a minute, and you're already joining in. I retract my invitation, Mariam. Get out. I'm joking. It's lovely to have you.
I mean, the world just needs to know, Faye. I'm sorry.
I'm gonna get a reputation, pal. I'm gonna have to like put some like
Too late.
Too late. Thanks, Johnny.
This is the problem when you're the common link between friends. Is like the easiest thing for those guys to do to bond is just to kind of both rip into you. So that's why.
That's true. I'll take one for the team to make everyone else feel comfortable.
Bring everyone together.
Incredibly important social role here.
Okay.
You're like Facebook. You know, you get everybody onto the platform.
Oh wow! Oh, I think that's the worst insult. You're like Facebook.
It's
right?
a sick Tech for Good live burn.
I'm literally
you
tweeting
are the
that right now.
personification of Facebook.
Oh my
Faye
god!
is not gonna sleep tonight.
I love you, Faye. But basically, I think my hope that I guess what I was mainly hoping for was just more techniques to counter misinformation on these platforms. I mean, there's like a couple, like WhatsApp is trying like some algorithms. Like we saw like Facebook was trying to set up an election hub and trying not to influence the elections by, actually shutting down some of their algorithms.
But haven't they said they're just going to turn that off now? Because the election's over, so they're like, oh, everything's fine now, so we'll just put it back.
Yeah, which is just ironic because it's like you did it because it was the right thing to do, and so now you're saying you're not going to do the right thing.
Right thing to do in the United States, though Facebook is a global community and there are elections going on in different countries all the time, and misinformation and disinformation is spreading all the time. So actually, that's a great segue into my hopes for 2021. As you all know, I am a very optimistic person. I really am. So I have lots of hopes. And for people who haven't heard me in the podcast for a while, I'll just give some context, which is that I went full time on Chen, thanks to a lot of COVID-19 funding and sort of that kind of thing in July. So I've been focusing a lot on gender and left my job in government accountability, but I still have some hopes related to that. So, Faye was just mentioning, sorry, not Faye, Mariam was mentioning, Faye and Mariam are just the same people now. So yeah, Mariam was mentioning, no, not, okay. So Mariam was mentioning about elections. Okay. And I was mentioning how like the fact that there's a whole like colonial aspect to how like tech platforms, Silicon Valley tech platforms run, not just Silicon Valley, actually, of the UK like platforms as well. So I'm really interested in a new publication called Rest of the World. Has anyone been following Rest of the World on, if not, sign up to their newsletter. The newsletter will make your day. Sign up to their Twitter, look at their podcast. They cover tech news from the rest of the world. It is amazing. It's so good to have some solid, like tech reporting that focuses on the global south, whatever you want to call it, like outside the bubbles of the US, Europe, and it's just so cool. So I think that's a really good one that I'm really like learning a lot from and really enjoying the commentary on it. And I'm also seeing, I've been involved in some government accountability projects past 7 years. And one thing, as you all have seen me harp about, heard me harp about, is government contracts and how not transparent they are. I spent 3 years of my life trying to convince government and local authorities across the world to publish more contracts. I really hope all these COVID-19 emergency procurement scandals are like what changes it. As an example, we've been trying to get something through to the UK government for past 3 since I joined. Yeah, 3 years when I joined the organization in the first place, open contracting. 3 years of meetings, papers, reports, all that stuff. And then they created a working group, which we were not part of. And then actually they released what they're going to do yesterday. So it took the COVID-19 scandal to really get them to actually commit to something. Though they've made lots of commitments before, but we were trying to push them to do more commitments, which were really specific around open data and the timeliness of publishing, how contracts are given, and also how they're tracked. So the fact that this whole like Turkish like t-shirt salesperson and these like disco owners like getting involved in procurement and the amount of loss that the UK has suffered this year, I really hope it changes things in the UK, but not just in the UK. Actually, I've seen lots of stories come out of the US, of like Latin America, and I'm just really like, my hope is that this solidifies that point about why supply chains need to be really transparent. And actually, today I read news that a Belgian minister by mistake released the actual prices at which the vaccine has been bought by the Belgian government. And so that's super cool because it was a mistake. But I really hope we basically start seeing those prices, which tells us how medicine pricing is so opaque, and this is how many countries lose out on, especially in the global south. So yeah, I'm really happy about things like that. I'm hoping this changes. I also think we've kind of reached an impasse when it comes to understanding things like diversity in tech. So this whole affair with Dr. Tim Nitgebrew and Anna, Google. And I was reading one of her interviews, and there was a line which just resonated so much with me. And I really think this is I hope our discourse has reached that level that we can move beyond this now. In which she says, I think Google liked the idea of me, but didn't like the reality of me. And I've faced that so many times in organizations and different spaces. And I really hope that collectively this things like this are pushing us past it. So many people have made commitments to diversity, inclusion, Black Lives Matter, but are they really ready for making that change? I hope this brings some sort of level of awareness to our organizations, and to look within and see what kinds of inclusion they like, because there are kinds and people can pick and choose that. And then on algorithms, I some of the stuff that I've been consulting on is around how it's so important that we be able to dissect an algorithm, especially, but also just know where algorithms are used. And my big hope is that somehow in countries and governments start requiring public authorities, at least public authorities, to start publishing when they are using algorithms, produced by who, and that there is some accountability mechanism so you're able to contest the way your life is impacted by the algorithm. So right now, if you don't get a job, or someone doesn't follow up on your case, you are able to pinpoint a human you spoke to at what date and what time and have an audit trail. And being able to have the audit trail with an algorithm would be so helpful. So I feel like we're kind of moving towards that space. So that is my hope. And on a very selfishly small note, because we started this podcast talking about, wow, it's so amazing to have the world of digital transformation really blasted open for all these charities that we've been trying to push to do this. I've also had that experience where I've been so excited to see the violence against women sector really embracing tech, but also so badly. So my hope is that we reach the digital maturity on the part of funders. They don't just throw digital funding. They actually help like organizations understand, like if that is a good investment of that money. Like somebody spending £50,000 to create a website which literally just has the same messaging like a TV ad has, like, it's like not a good use of that. And especially like what happens in the long term. Or what I'm seeing a lot more of is a lot of tech companies offering free like AI products to replace human elements, but actually, should those human elements be replaced? And just thinking through these like deeper questions, my hope is that the sector is able to embrace that way of thinking, and funders are able to create spaces for them to do that. And with that, I rest my hopes for 2021.
And I just want to add to that as well, and hope that we don't just rest on tech. And I think that's a good place to like end. We've rushed to create tech during the coronavirus, but what if that's not the right answer? You're going to need to do some blended delivery. Like it's probably, and I hope that people in the sector realize that. And once we're all back to normal, then we do go back to some face-to-face when it makes sense. Tech isn't always the answer.
The best uses of tech you're seeing at the moment are just facilitating human connection where it isn't easily possible, and it does the job, gets out of the way, and as soon as you see it, it's not doing as good a job as it could be, I think. Is that the sort of end of the final bits of the podcast now?
Harry, what do you think? Harry?
Yeah.
You were both so brilliant. I don't know if I can add any value. I usually bring the darker twist to it. So I guess there's been a lot this year about regulation. I think the EU is starting to really get angry with the big tech firms. I think in some strange way, Trump has probably helped that, not necessarily from the right direction, but certainly with the loud voice. And I'm hopeful in a way that next year will bring true regulation, not regulation by the back door or kind of crowdfunded, just people getting upset about it, but actually real impact. There's always been an issue where governments have really struggled to understand technology. I mean, they tend to be years behind, and the regulation tends to be years behind just through process. But it feels like the EU, brilliant for us, right? Feels like the EU is definitely starting to get on top of it. I think they've got some interesting people behind it, and so next year I think there's going to be a big clash whether it will actually make any change long term. There's always going to be ways around those things. I think even as smaller companies, Facebook would still kind of be Facebook by the back door. But the Facebooks, the Googles, the Instagram in Facebook's world, I think all of that is going to be really interesting. It might open some interesting opportunities for smaller organizations, smaller firms and startups. But then, as Hera was saying, kind of the problem with the problem with allowing all of that to happen is that there isn't always kind of the stop and check before people start to create things. Like some of the worst things in the world, like gender me, or whatever the system was that you put your name in and it tells you whether you're male or female. Like doctor is always male, right? So having those opportunities for smaller companies or even startups can actually be a real risk to the tech for good, or at least the avoidance of tech for bad, because once you open those opportunities up to people, you may well end up with people doing bad things because they don't understand that they're bad. Their intentions may be good and the impact may be negative. I always have Johnny ringing in my ears when I say those two things. So yeah, I'm hoping for regulation. I'm hoping for some actual regulation that really offers both some ground rules for everybody, but also some limits on how much data, how big, how much money, how much control. I mean, Facebook is almost governmental, isn't it? It's at the point where it can actually have so much sway that it can have a much bigger impact than most of the nations in the world. So that's really my hope, is that there's some weight behind these countries who are actually trying to do something powerful, and it does have an impact beyond taxes that just mean the prices of software go up, because it's pointless. It needs to actually be thought about, and controls need to be applied in a way that benefits everybody from kind of third sector tech for good startups, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, that's my hope. It sounds very negative, but I think actually there's a real kind of silver lining to the fight that's about to kick off with the big tech firms and the best of us when it comes to the governments and the regulators.
I was going to say, it does seem like the EU's really getting to grips with this at the moment, and they are, I wouldn't say spoiling for a fight, but they're kind of a bit more confident in actually sort of taking on some of these larger tech companies. It's almost like that they've had some impetus because something was holding them back, and they've just managed to cast that away, and now they're really getting moving forward with it. So whatever that was, that's great to see.
We have to finish. We're like almost exactly on time. I know. Any final thoughts?
I mean, it can't get much worse, can it?
No, it can't get much worse. We're moving into 2021. We're saying goodbye to 2020, right? Yeah, so cheers, everyone. Thanks for being here on Zoom through the whole thing. That is all we have time for this entire year. For the entire year. Thanks for listening, and see you in 2021. As always, listeners, what did you think? Please tell us. Get in touch on Twitter at TechForGoodLive or hello@techforgood.live. Thank you to Kevin and Matt who commented on our YouTube. Kevin, good point. A lot of excuses for inaction have melted away under the heat of COVID-19. What a nice comment to end on. And give us a nice iTunes review. Tell your mates about the podcast. We will be back early January. Thanks to Podcast.go for hosting this podcast, and also the Co-op Foundation and Luminate for continued support. And obviously, thank you to the team that is on this Zoom and the wider awesome volunteer team, the community around it, and all of the supporters. Thank you so much, everybody. And that's it. Bye.
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 Bye, everyone.
How do I finish streaming?